They put handcuffs on a man who hadn't moved an inch, while the whole world was falling apart around him. That's the part nobody who was there will ever forget. Not the smoke, not the screaming, the handcuffs, on a soldier who had just done the bravest thing any of us had ever seen a human being do. I need to tell you the whole thing, from the start, because if I just tell you the ending you won't believe it. I barely believe it, and I was standing 40 feet away with my own two eyes open the entire time. Let me take you back to that morning. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I'd been complaining about it. My sister, her name's Dana, she'd flown in from Ohio to visit me for 2 weeks. She had this whole itinerary printed out on actual paper, laminated, the works. And Tuesday was Royal Day. That's what she wrote on it. Royal Day. She wanted to see the palace, the guards, the whole postcard version of London, and I'd been living in the city for 6 years at that point, and I'd never once bothered to go watch the guards. You live somewhere long enough, and the famous stuff just becomes the thing you drive past. So I was a little grumpy about it, if I'm honest. It was early. The coffee I'd grabbed was too hot and then somehow too cold 10 minutes later, the way it always is. And it was one of those gray London mornings where the sky can't decide what it wants to do. Not raining, just thinking about it. We came up out of the tube station and the air smelled like wet stone and bus fumes and somebody's cigarette. Normal London. You could hear pigeons. You could hear a busker somewhere with a guitar doing a song I half recognized. And there were people everywhere, tourists mostly. You could tell them apart from the locals right away. The tourists were the ones looking up. Dana grabbed my arm. Come on, I read it's better if we get there early for the changing thing. I let her drag me. That's a detail I keep coming back to. If she hadn't dragged me, if I'd been slower, we'd have been in a different spot. Life turns on stuff like that, and you never know it in the moment. We ended up near the front, not right at the railings, but close, close enough. And there he was. The guard. I want to describe him properly because later on it matters. He was standing at his post the way they do, that stillness that doesn't look human until you've watched it for a while. Tall fella. The red tunic, the tall dark bearskin cap that makes them all look about 8 feet high. His boots were so polished you could have checked your teeth in them. And his eyes were doing that thing where they're open and looking straight ahead, but they're not looking at you. Looking through you. Through the crowd. Through everything. Kids were doing the usual. Standing next to him, pulling faces, their parents snapping photos. One little boy, maybe 6, kept marching back and forth in front of him doing an impression, stomping his little feet, and the guard didn't move. Didn't smile. Nothing. The boy's dad was laughing. Everybody was laughing. It was nice, actually. It was the kind of small, warm moment you get in a crowd of strangers who are all in a good mood. I remember thinking, how does he do that? Just stand there. Hour after hour. People in his face, cameras, kids, the lot, and he just holds it. I remember thinking it must be so boring. I remember thinking that. Boring. I feel stupid about that now. Dana was reading facts off her phone out loud, the way she does. It says they're not actually just for show, they're real soldiers they do tour in. Oh, it says one of them fainted once because they're not allowed to lock their knees. And I was half listening, nodding, sipping the cold coffee, and I let my eyes wander. That's when I noticed the man. I don't want to make more of it than it was because in the moment it was nothing. It was a nothing detail. But you know how sometimes something just catches on your eye like a thread catching on a nail? There was a man about 20 feet from us, near the edge of the crowd, and he was wearing a heavy jacket. That's it. That's all it was. A heavy jacket. And it was mild that morning, not warm exactly, but mild. Everybody else was in light stuff. And this guy had this big padded jacket zipped right up to his throat. And he had a bag with him, a dark hold all, the kind you'd take to the gym. And he wasn't looking at the guards. Everybody was looking at the guards. That was the whole point of being there. But this man was looking around, at the crowd, at the buildings, sort of counting things with his eyes, and he kept touching the bag, not holding it, touching it, like he was checking it was still there. I looked at him for maybe 3 seconds, And then Dana said, "Oh, they're starting," and pointed, and I looked away, and I forgot about him completely. Just like that. Human brain. You see something a little off, and unless it screams at you, you file it under "not my business" and you move on. I've thought about those 3 seconds so many times. There was music starting up somewhere further along, the band, that heavy formal marching sound, and the crowd sort of tightened up and pushed forward a bit the way crowds do when something's about to happen. Phones went up. Dana had hers up. I had mine somewhere in my pocket. I hadn't even bothered. And the guard near us, our guard, I'd started thinking of him as ours. He shifted. Just slightly. Getting ready to do the movements, I suppose, the drill, whatever comes next. I was watching his face when it happened. I'll tell you exactly what I felt because I've never been able to describe it right, and I'm going to try again now. There was a sound, but sound is the wrong word. It wasn't a sound the way a firework is a sound or a car backfiring is a sound. It was a thing that happened to my whole body at once. It came up through my feet. It hit my chest like a shove from an invisible hand. And the air, I don't know how to say this, the air changed. It got hard for a second, like the whole street flinched. And then everything was wrong. There was smoke. It came fast, this gray-white wall of it, rolling out from over near where, I didn't put it together in the moment, but it was near where that man had been, where the crowd was thickest at the edge. And the noise came a half-second late, the real noise, the roar of it, and then under that a sound I never want to hear again as long as I live, which was the sound of a lot of people screaming at the exact same time. I don't remember deciding to move. 1 second I was standing up and the next I was down, sort of half-crouched, and I had Dana's coat in my fist and I was pulling her and she was pulling me and neither of us knew which way. That's the thing nobody tells you. In the films people run somewhere. In real life there is no somewhere. Everyone was moving and no one was moving. People were falling over each other. A pram went over. Somebody's shopping bag burst and there were oranges rolling on the ground, and I remember staring at the oranges like they were the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Oranges, rolling, while the world ended. My ears were gone, just this high whine like a kettle and everything else far away and underwater. I could see Dana's mouth moving. I couldn't hear a word. There was grit in my teeth. Actual grit, dust and dirt. I'd breathed it in without knowing. And I looked up. I don't know why I looked toward the guard. Maybe because that's where my eyes had been all morning, so that's where they went when I needed something to hold on to. But I looked up through the smoke and the running people, and there he was. He hadn't moved. I want you to understand what I'm telling you. The bomb had gone off maybe 70, 80 feet from him, close enough that the smoke was drifting right over his post. Close enough that people who'd been standing next to him a moment ago were now on the ground. Grown men were running. A police officer nearby had his hand on his own head, ducking, moving. Everybody with any sense was getting low or getting gone. And this soldier was standing at attention, like a statue carved out of the morning. Straight back, chin level, eyes forward. The rifle held exactly the way it had been held. The bearskin cap didn't so much as tilt. Smoke was curling around him, and he stood in it like a man standing in a light rain he decided not to notice. I thought, and I'm not proud of this, I thought, is he dead? Is he actually dead standing up? Because my brain could not make sense of a living person not reacting to that. It didn't compute. A living person flinches. A living person runs. That's the deal. That's what bodies do. But then I saw him blink, slow, deliberate, and I saw his jaw, this tiny movement in his jaw like a man clenching down on something. And I understood he was alive and awake and feeling every single bit of it. He wasn't a statue. He was a man choosing, second by second, not to move. And that was so much more terrifying and so much more beautiful than if he'd just been frozen. Now here's the thing I learned later, and I'll tell it to you now so you understand, even though I didn't know it standing there. Those guards, they're not decoration. Everyone thinks they're decoration. Tourists prod at them, kids pull faces, people treat the whole thing like it's a theme park. But they are soldiers, full soldiers, trained the same as any of them. And the drill, that impossible stillness, it isn't a party trick. It's discipline that goes all the way down to the bone. It's the thing that's left when everything else in a man wants to run, and he decides no. He decided no. And I'll tell you something else I found out after. His post where he was standing put him between the blast and one of the gates. The gate, a way in. And in the middle of all that chaos with people scattering everywhere, a guard leaving his post could have meant a gap. A gap where nobody's watching. And on a day when somebody's just set off a bomb, the one thing you cannot afford is a gap where nobody's watching. He knew that. In the middle of hell, some part of his mind was still holding the line, because that was the job, and the job didn't stop because things got frightening. The job especially didn't stop then. I didn't know all that in the moment. In the moment, I just saw a man standing in smoke, and I couldn't look away from him. Then the smoke thickened, and I lost him. Everything after that goes a bit broken in my memory. I know we ended up against a wall, me and Dana, pressed up against cold stone with a bunch of other people. A woman next to us was holding her little girl so tight the girl was complaining, which is a strange thing to be grateful for, a child well enough to complain. There was a man near us who kept saying, "It's all right, it's all right, it's all right," over and over, not to anyone in particular, just saying it, maybe to himself. Sirens started somewhere far off and got closer. That up and down wail, more than one, a lot of them. My hearing started coming back in patches. First the whine got quieter and then I could hear the sirens properly, and then I could hear people, individual people calling names. That's the sound that stays with you. People calling names into the smoke. First names, shouted, again and again, that particular note in a voice when someone's calling for a person they love and they don't know yet if that person can answer. Dana was okay. I kept checking her like an idiot, patting her arms, her face. She kept saying she was fine. There was blood on her hand, but it turned out it wasn't hers, and to this day we don't know whose it was, and that's a thing you don't really get over, honestly. And through all of it, in the back of my head, this one thought kept surfacing like a cork in water: the guard. Is the guard still standing? I don't know why it mattered so much to me. It just did. It was like if he was still standing, then the world hadn't completely come apart. Does that make sense? He'd become the thing I was measuring everything else against. The smoke started to thin. Slowly. It drifted and pulled apart, and you could start to see across the open space again, and it was a mess. I won't describe all of it, but it was a mess. And there were people helping people, which even in the middle of the horror was the thing that made my throat go tight. Strangers on their knees next to strangers, holding them, taking off their own coats to put over them. And I looked toward the post. He was still there. Still standing, smoke drifting off him now like steam off a horse in cold weather. His red tunic had gone gray with dust. There was a mark down one side of his face, a scrape or a cut, I couldn't tell, a dark line from his cheekbone down toward his jaw, and he was still at attention, still, forward, rifle in place. Like the last 4 minutes had happened to a different London, and he was standing guard over the one that hadn't been touched. People were starting to notice him now. The ones who'd stayed, the ones huddled near the railings. I heard someone say, "Look at him." I actually heard it, my hearing was back enough, a woman's voice cracked. "Look at him, he never moved." And a few people were looking, and there was this feeling starting, hard to describe, this sort of awe going around, quiet under the sirens. Because you could feel that everyone who saw it understood they were looking at something rare, something out of an old story. A man doing his duty when every reason in the world had just been handed to him to stop. I thought that was the story. Standing there, I genuinely thought, that's it, that's the thing I'll tell people about for the rest of my life, the guard who never flinched. I had no idea it hadn't even started yet. Because that's when the other people arrived. The ones who didn't see it. The ones who came running in after from the outside, into a scene they didn't understand, with adrenaline through the roof and orders being shouted and everybody's nerves shredded to nothing. And to them, coming in fresh through the smoke, a man in a dark dusted uniform standing dead still right next to the blast site, right next to a gate, not responding to anything, holding a rifle. To them, he didn't look like a hero. I watched it happen and I couldn't get there in time and I couldn't make them understand. And neither could anyone else, not at first, because everyone was shocked stupid and no one could get their words to work. Two of them came at him fast. I'll be careful how I say this because I've thought a lot about it and I don't think they were bad men. I think they were frightened men doing a frightened thing badly. They came at him from the side, shouting, and I couldn't make out the words but I could read the shape of it: get down, drop it, hands, the whole thing, and the guard. The guard didn't move. Of course he didn't. That was the whole point of him. He'd stood through a bomb. He wasn't going to break his post for shouting. And I think this is the awful part. I think his stillness, the very thing that made him magnificent, was the exact thing that made them read him wrong. A frightened man in that moment, coming in cold, sees a figure who won't respond, won't get down, won't drop the weapon, standing where the worst thing just happened. And their fear filled in a story. The wrong story. The absolute opposite of the truth. And I saw one of them grab his arm. I heard Dana say no under her breath, just no, because we'd both seen it. We'd both watched this man be the bravest thing in London for 4 straight minutes, and now, right in front of us, they were pulling his arms back and I saw the flash of the cuffs, the metal catching what little light there was, and I heard them go on. That sound. Click, click. And the crowd near me made this noise, this collective sound, like a groan and a gasp at once, because the people who'd watched what he did could not believe what they were now seeing. They cuffed him, they actually cuffed him. And here's the thing that broke my heart clean in half: he let them. He didn't fight it. He didn't shout, "That's not fair, I saw what I saw, I never even touched anyone," none of that. He just let them. He kept his back straight even as they pulled his arms behind him. He kept his chin up even as they pushed his head down. There was this terrible dignity to it, this soldier standing there in handcuffs with dust in the cut on his face, having just done the impossible, and being treated like the thing he'd stood against. Somebody in the crowd started shouting at the officers. He never moved. He stood there the whole time. "Leave him, he's one of yours." More voices joined it. A man was pushing forward and other people were holding him back. It was turning, the crowd was turning, ugly and hot, and you could feel it might go somewhere very bad very fast, because people had just watched a bomb go off and now they were watching an injustice, and there's only so much a crowd can hold before it spills. And the guard, through all of it, the shouting, the cuffs, the hands on him, the guard just looked forward. Same as he'd looked forward the whole time, like he was still on post. Like even now, even cuffed, some part of him refused to stop being what he was. I remember thinking, someone has to fix this. Someone with authority. Someone who was here, who saw, who can walk in and set it right, because if it's left to us, to the crowd, to these panicking men, it ends badly for everyone. And that's exactly when I heard a new voice. It cut through everything. Not loud exactly, or not only loud. It had a weight to it. It was the kind of voice that spent years being obeyed, and you could hear that in it, in one single word, before I even saw the man it belonged to. The crowd near the front started to part. And through the last of the drifting smoke, a figure was coming. Older, straight-backed, moving fast but not running, that walk that important men have, the walk that says the situation will wait for me, I do not wait for it. He had rank on him, you could see it even from a distance, something about the way the light caught his shoulders, the way the 2 officers holding the guard went stiff the second they clocked him coming. I didn't know yet who he was. But I was about to learn, along with everyone else in that square, that of all the mistakes those 2 men could have made that morning, putting handcuffs on that particular soldier, with that particular man on his way over, was going to be the one they'd remember for the rest of their lives. I've told a lot of people about the colonel since that day, and every time I hit the same wall, because words don't hold what it was like to watch that man walk into a scene like that and change the whole temperature of it just by arriving. You know how sometimes one person walks into a room and everything sort of rearranges itself around them. You felt it. A teacher walking into a rowdy class. A parent coming home. There's a shift, a settling before a single word gets said. This was that, but 100 times over, in the middle of the worst thing I've ever lived through. He came through the crowd and the crowd let him. Not because he pushed. He didn't push. People just moved. The way water moves out of the way of something heavy. And I got my first proper look at him as he came past, not 10 feet from where me and Dana were still pressed against the wall. He was older. 60s, I'd have guessed, maybe more. Gray hair, cut close and neat even in all that chaos, and a face that had clearly spent a lot of years outdoors and a lot of years not being argued with. He wasn't in the red tunic. He was in a darker uniform, the sort that has quiet, serious rank on it rather than the showy stuff, and somehow that made it worse for the two officers, because you could tell straight away this wasn't a man who dressed up for tourists. This was a man who'd done the actual thing, whatever the actual thing is. He'd done it. And his eyes. I caught his eyes for half a second as he passed, and there was no panic in them at all. None. Everyone else in that square had eyes like frightened animals, mine included, I'm sure, and this man had eyes like still water. He'd taken in the whole scene already. You could tell. He'd walked in and read it in about 2 seconds flat, the smoke, the hurt people, the helpers, and there, at the post, his soldier in handcuffs. I found out afterwards who he was. I'll tell you now so it lands right. He was a colonel. A serving colonel high up, one of the men responsible for those very soldiers, their training, their conduct, their lives. That guard in the cuffs was, in the most real way, his man, his responsibility, his to answer for and his to protect. And he'd been nearby when it happened. I never got the full story of why, something about an inspection, a visit, I don't know, but he'd been close, and when word reached him, he'd come. Fast. So picture it. 2 officers, hearts going like drums, holding a cuffed man they think is a threat. And bearing down on them, the one person in all of London who knew exactly what that cuffed man was, and exactly what he'd just done, and exactly how wrong they had it. He didn't shout when he reached them. That surprised me. I'd expected shouting. I think the whole crowd had braced for shouting. But he stopped a few feet short and he looked at the 2 officers, and then he looked slowly, deliberately at his soldier, at the cuffs, at the dust turning the red tunic gray, at the dark line of the cut running down the man's face. He took it all in, and when he spoke his voice was low, level, and it carried anyway because everyone around had gone quiet to hear it. "Take those off him." Just that, 4 words. And the officers, you could see it, they froze. One of them started to say something, started to explain, the way you do when you know you've done something and you're reaching for the reason before you even know if you have one. "Sir, he wouldn't respond, he wouldn't." The colonel turned his head and looked at him. Just looked. And the officer's words dried up in his mouth. I've never seen anything like it. This grown man, an officer, in the middle of doing his job as he understood it, and one look shut him down like a tap. "He wouldn't respond," the colonel repeated, quiet, and there was something under the quiet now, something you did not want pointed at you. "No, he wouldn't." And then he said the thing that turned it, the thing that half the crowd would end up repeating to reporters and to each other and to their families for years. He said he wouldn't respond because he was doing his duty, while you were still deciding whether to run. You could have heard a pin drop. In the middle of sirens and smoke and everything, that sentence landed in this pocket of total silence, and it went through the crowd like a current. Because it was true. Everyone knew it was true. We'd all watched it. This man had put words to the thing all of us had felt and couldn't say. The officer's face, I actually felt sorry for him, watching it, because you could see the moment it hit. The moment he understood what he'd done. He'd come running in to be brave, to handle a threat, and the colonel had just held a mirror up and shown him what had really happened, which was that the bravest man in the square had already handled it, standing still, and this officer had put handcuffs on that bravery. The colonel stepped closer, and now his voice dropped even lower, so low I only caught it because the whole square was silent, and I think it was meant only for the 2 officers really, but sound travels strange in the open and I heard it. "Do you know what he was standing in front of?" he said. "That gate. Do you know what's behind it? Do you know what happens if that post is empty for 4 minutes on a day like this?" Neither of them answered. What could they say? "He knew," the colonel said. "He knew every second. He felt everything you felt. His body wanted to run the same as yours did. The difference," and here he paused, and I swear the pause was worse than any shout, "the difference is that he didn't. He held. Because if he'd broken, there'd have been a hole in the line, and a hole in the line today could have finished what somebody started." Somewhere behind me, a woman was crying quietly. The gentle kind. The kind that comes when something true and hard gets said out loud. "And you," the colonel went on, and now he wasn't just talking to those two, I don't think. I think he was talking to something bigger, to all of it, to every person who'd ever poked at one of those guards or laughed at them or called them decoration. You looked at a soldier who just saved lives by not moving, and you decided he was the danger. Because he was still. Because still frightened you more than running did. I'll never forget that. Because still frightened you more than running did. I've thought about that sentence 1,000 times. It's about more than that day, isn't it? It's about all of us. How we trust the loud thing and fear the quiet thing and get it exactly backwards. The officer with the cuffs, his hands were shaking now. I could see them from where I stood. He got them off. Fumbled the key, dropped it, picked it up, got the cuffs off the guard's wrists. And the guard, I watched him the whole time. The guard did not gloat. Did not rub his wrists and glare. Did not say a word. The second his hands were free, he brought them back to his rifle, and he came back to attention, straight back, chin level, eyes forward, exactly as he'd been. Back on post. Like the cuffs had been a small weather event he'd waited out. And that somehow was the thing that finished me off. That's when I felt my own eyes go. Because a lesser man, freed after that humiliation, would have made it about himself. Would have had a right to. And this man just went back to work. In front of a crowd that was now openly weeping and murmuring and starting here and there to clap, hesitant at first. A few pairs of hands, then more. This man just quietly returned to being what he'd never stopped being. The colonel looked at him then. And this is the part that I hold on to most out of the whole day. He looked at his soldier and his face changed. All that hardness he'd shown the officers, it didn't disappear exactly, but underneath it, for just a moment, something else came up. Something like grief and pride at the same time. The look a father gives a son he's terrified for and proud of in the same breath. He said one thing to the guard, quietly. I only just caught it. He said, "Well done." That's it, 2 words, well done, but the way he said it, God. There was a whole life in it. There was, I saw what you did and I know what it cost you and I will not let anyone take it from you, all folded into 2 small words. And the guard's face didn't move, he held the discipline, but I saw his eyes. I was close enough. I saw his eyes shine, just for a second, before he blinked it back and locked it down. That's when I lost it properly, if I'm honest. I stood against that cold wall with my sister's hand in mine, and I cried like a child. And I wasn't the only one. Now I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make the 2 officers into villains and leave it there. But that's not how it went, and it's not how the colonel let it go either, and that's part of why I think he was a great man and not just a hard one. Because after the guard was freed, the colonel turned back to the 2 officers, and I braced for him to finish them off. Everyone did. The crowd was against them now, hard, and a lesser leader would have fed them to it, would have made a show of it, made them small. He didn't. He looked at them for a long moment, and then he said in a completely different voice, still firm, but the anger gone out of it, replaced with something steadier, he said, "You made a mistake today, a bad one, but you ran toward the smoke, not away from it. Most people didn't. So learn this and carry it. The thing that's still is not always the thing to fear. Sometimes the still thing is the one holding everything together." And then, and this is the part I love, he said, "Now, there are people hurt behind you. Go and be useful." And they went, both of them, straight away. You could see the relief in them and the shame, and underneath it a kind of gratitude that he'd given them away to be something other than the men who cuffed a hero. He'd shown them the mistake in full, made them feel every inch of it, and then handed them a road out. Go and be useful. And they took it running. That's what a real leader does, I've come to think. He doesn't just punish. He corrects and then he redeems. He shows you the worst of what you did and then he points you at a way to be better and he trusts you to take it. The lesson wasn't the shame. The shame was just the door. The lesson was what came after. I stood there and I watched those two men go and kneel down beside injured strangers and start helping, really helping, with everything they had, and I thought he did that. The colonel did that. He turned two men from the worst thing they did today into part of the recovery. In about 90 seconds, with his voice and nothing else. The clapping had spread by now. It was strange clapping in a place like that with the hurt and the smoke, but it wasn't celebration. It wasn't that kind of clapping. It was the other kind. The kind that says we saw and we won't forget and thank you. It rolled around the square, uneven, broken up by sirens, but real. People were clapping for the guard, for the colonel, for the whole idea that in the middle of the worst thing there were still men who held. The guard didn't acknowledge it. Couldn't, I suppose, still on post, still holding the drill. But I like to think he heard it. I like to think that under that tall cap and that unmoving face, some part of him heard a whole crowd of frightened strangers telling him they'd seen what he was. And the colonel, he heard it too. And he did something then that I've turned over in my mind ever since. He stepped back from the post, and he came to attention himself. This colonel, this senior man in front of everyone, he squared himself up and he faced his soldier and he held himself at attention for a moment, not for the crowd, not for show, but for the man on the post. One soldier honoring another, the senior honoring the junior. And then he gave a small nod, and he turned to go and manage the rest of it, because there was a lot of rest of it, and it needed managing, and that was his job too. I remember watching him walk off into the smoke to go and do the hard, unglamorous work of the aftermath and thinking, I will never forget your face. And I haven't. But here's the thing. Even after all that, even after the cuffs came off and the lesson was taught and the clapping and the colonel walking away, the day wasn't done with us. Not by a long way. Because I hadn't understood yet why the guard's stillness had mattered so much. Not really. I understood the words the colonel said about the gate, about the hole in the line, but I hadn't seen it, and I was about to. Because as the smoke thinned right out, as the medics flooded in and the square filled up with people in uniform who actually knew what they were doing, something started to happen near that gate. The one the guard had been standing in front of. The one the colonel had pointed at when he said, do you know what happens if that post is empty? There was a movement in the crowd near it. A wrongness. The same kind of wrongness I'd felt looking at that man in the heavy jacket an hour before. That little snag on the eye that your brain wants to ignore. And this time, I didn't ignore it. This time, I watched. And what I saw in the next few minutes is the part of the story that finally made me understand, all the way down in my bones, exactly what that soldier had been holding, and exactly why a man being willing to stand still while the world burns is not a small thing, not a party trick, not decoration. It's the whole thing. It's everything. I need to be careful telling this last part, not because anything about it is too much to say, but because I don't want to dress it up. What actually happened near that gate was quieter than the bomb. Smaller. If you'd blinked, you'd have missed it. And yet it's the part that changed how I understand everything. Let me tell you what I saw. As the smoke pulled apart and the medics moved in, there was still confusion everywhere. That's the thing about after, it doesn't just snap back to order, it stays messy for a long time. People wandering. People looking for each other. Some folk had frozen up completely and were just standing where they'd stood, staring at nothing. And in all that mess near the gate the guard had held, I saw a small knot of movement that didn't fit. There was a bag on the ground. Not the guards, not anybody's obvious. A bag sitting near the base of the railings close to that gate, half ducked against the stone where in all the chaos nobody had clocked it. Dark, ordinary, the kind of bag you see 1,000 of a day and never think twice about. And here's where the cold went through me, because I remembered the man in the heavy jacket. The one I'd looked at for 3 seconds and filed under not my business. The one who'd kept touching his hold-all. And a thought arrived in my head, fully formed and horrible. What if the thing that went off wasn't the only thing? What if the smoke, the panic, the scatter, what if that was the first move, and the point of it was to make everyone run, to make everyone break, to open up a gap somewhere it mattered? Near a gate. Near a way-in. I don't know if that's what it was. I want to be honest with you. I never got the full official account, and I'm not going to pretend I did, and I'm not going to pretend I understand things I don't. But I'll tell you what I saw with my own eyes, and you can sit with it the way I've had to. I saw one of those officers, one of the two who'd cuffed the guard, the same ones the colonel had turned toward the injured. I saw him spot that bag. He'd been kneeling by someone, helping, doing the useful thing he'd been sent to do. And he looked up and he saw it, and I watched his whole body go still in a way I recognized now, because I'd been watching a man hold himself still all morning. And instead of freezing, instead of the panic that had made him grab the guard, he moved right. This time he moved right. He got people back from it. Calm, fast, arms wide, moving the crowd away from the gate, from the bag, clearing a space. And he called out and more uniforms came, the ones who deal with exactly that sort of thing, and they took over and they moved everyone back further, and the whole area around that gate got cleared and sealed and handled. I don't know what was in the bag, I never will. Maybe nothing. Maybe someone's forgotten shopping. Maybe the worst thing you can imagine. I've made my peace with not knowing mostly, though it visits me some nights. But here's what I do know. That gate, the one the bag sat near, the one the whole quiet business unfolded in front of, was the gate the guard had refused to leave. When the bomb went off and every instinct in the world screamed run, that soldier had stood his ground in front of that exact spot. And because he held it, that spot never went unwatched, never went empty. There was never a 4-minute window where nobody was standing at that gate. He'd closed the door on that possibility with his own body and his own will. Before anyone even knew, there was a door to close. The colonel had known. That's what got me. Standing there watching the officers seal off the gate, I finally understood the colonel's words from earlier. Do you know what happens if that post is empty for 4 minutes on a day like this? He hadn't been making a speech. He'd been telling the plain truth. He'd looked at that scene and understood instantly, in a way the rest of us couldn't, that the guard's stillness wasn't stubbornness or shock. It was the line holding. It was the whole reason the worst version of that morning didn't happen. I looked back at the post. The guard was still there. Of course he was. He'd stood through the bomb. He'd stood through the cuffs. He'd stood through the crowd turning and the clapping and the colonel and all of it. And now, as the square slowly filled with order again, as the injured were carried out and the frightened were led away and the sealed gate was made safe behind him, he stood on. Same straight back. Same level chin. The cut on his face had dried dark now. The red of his tunic was still gray with dust. And he held. At some point, I don't know exactly when, because time had gone strange, the relief came. That's the word they use, I learned later when the next lot come to take over a post. A small group came, moving with that same clipped precision, and there was a bit of drill movements I didn't understand. And then it was done, and he was relieved, and only then did that soldier step down from where he'd stood through the end of the world. And even then he didn't break. He didn't sag or stumble or let go of himself. He marched off, straight, contained. Whatever he was feeling, and he had to have been feeling everything, all of it, the fear he'd held down for so long finally allowed to come up. He kept it inside until he was somewhere the public couldn't see. That was the last I saw of him. His back marching away, unbroken, disappearing behind the ranks of people who'd come to put the world back together. I never learned his name. I want you to know that. In all the times I've told this story, people ask me his name and I don't have it. He was just the guard. And maybe that's right, maybe that's how it should be, because it wasn't about him being a particular man with a particular name. It was about what he stood for. Anyone in that uniform, trained the way he was trained, holding the line the way he held it, that's the point. He wasn't special because of who he was. He was special because of what he chose, second after second. when every reason in the world was handed to him to choose otherwise. Me and Dana got out of there eventually. They moved us, checked us over, took our details in case they needed witnesses. Dana's laminated itinerary was gone, lost somewhere in it all, and I remember her holding her empty hands and half laughing, half crying about the itinerary, because sometimes your mind grabs onto a small daft thing when it can't hold the big thing. Royal Day. She'd written Royal Day on it in purple pen. We didn't talk much on the way back. What was there to say? But that night, sitting in my flat with cups of tea we weren't drinking, she said something I've never forgot. She said, "I keep thinking about how I nearly didn't drag you there." And then she said, "And I keep thinking about that man, how he just stood there. I don't think I understood before today what that even meant. Standing your ground. I thought it was a saying. I thought it was a saying too. Now I know it's a thing a person can actually do with their actual body in the actual worst moment of their life. Stand their ground. Hold the line. Not because they're not afraid he was afraid, I saw it. I saw his jaw clench and his eyes shine, but because there's something they've decided matters more than their own fear. And they hold. And by holding, they keep the rest of us safe in ways we don't even find out about until later, if we find out at all. I think about the colonel too, almost as much as the guard, because the guard's courage, as huge as it was the courage of one man in one spot. But the colonel, he showed me a different kind. The courage to walk into chaos and stay clear-headed. The courage to protect his own man from a crowd's confusion and two frightened officers' mistake, without shamming those officers into ruin, and instead turning them into part of the answer. The courage to be fair when fairness was the hardest thing. He taught a lesson that day, a painful one, but the pain wasn't the point. The point was what he built out of it. Two men who'd made a terrible mistake, kneeling in the aftermath, helping, one of them alert enough, minutes later, to spot the very thing that needed spotting. He made better men in the space of a single conversation. That's a kind of power I didn't know existed until I watched it happen. I've told this story so many times now, at dinners, to friends, once to a room of people who didn't quite believe me until Dana, who was there, nodded along. And every time I tell it, someone asks the same thing. They ask, weren't the officers the bad guys for cuffing him? And I always say no. That's the thing I most want people to take from it. They weren't bad. They were frightened and they got it wrong because in a frightening moment the still man looked more dangerous than the running one. And that's a mistake human beings make over and over in big ways and small every single day. We trust the loud thing. We fear the quiet thing. We look at the person who won't panic, who won't run, who just holds, and something in us finds that unnerving and we get it backwards. The colonel saw all that. That's why his lesson mattered. He wasn't teaching two men not to be brave. He was teaching all of us to look again at what bravery actually looks like. Sometimes it's the man charging forward, and sometimes, more often than we ever give it credit for, it's the man who simply will not move. I went back months later, on my own. On a normal day, a bright one, the kind of clear London morning that feels like an apology for all the gray ones. The square was full of tourists again, kids pulling faces, parents with cameras, a busker somewhere, pigeons, all of it exactly as it had been, as if nothing had ever happened there. And there was a guard on the post. Not the same man, or maybe it was, I couldn't have told you, they hold themselves so identically, standing there, straight back. Level chin, eyes forward, looking through everyone, through everything. And a little boy was marching up and down in front of him, doing the impression, stomping his little feet, and his dad was laughing. And the guard didn't move, didn't smile, held it perfectly, and everybody thought it was just the show. Just the postcard. Just the thing you photograph and post and forget. I stood at the back of the crowd and I watched, and I felt my throat go tight because I was the only one there who knew. I was the only one who knew what that stillness could mean. What it could hold back. What it had held back once on a gray Tuesday, while the world came apart and one man decided, second after second, not to move. I didn't take a photo, I just watched him for a while, and before I left I did something that probably looked mad to anyone watching. I stood up a bit straighter myself, squared my shoulders, and I gave him a small nod. He didn't nod back, of course, couldn't, wouldn't. That's the whole point of him. But I like to think he understood. Because that's the thing about the ones who hold the line. Most of the time, nobody claps. Most of the time, nobody even knows there was a line or that it was ever in danger or that a man stood in front of it and refused to break. They just walk past. They take their photo. They move on with their day safe and never once find out what it cost or who paid it or how close it came. And the ones who hold, they don't do it for the clapping. They never did. They do it because somebody has to stand still when everything says run. And thank God on that gray Tuesday, somebody did.